Every medicine costs about 1.5 billion to develop. It can be really fascinating, the serendipity of discovery. That's why you shouldn't use antibiotics if you don't need them. If you've not got a bacterial infection, people get given antibiotics because they've got a virus. It's a terrible thing. As a charity, you're in a situation where everything that fails tells you something about the disease.
Because I would assume if it's going to save someone's life, the NHS would pay for it, right?
Depends how much it costs to save that person's life.
Welcome to the Visionary podcast, where we discuss science, medicine, physical health, and mental well-being. Circling back to introducing new drugs to patients, I read somewhere that Germany gives patients access to new drugs and treatments almost immediately after authorization. Why can't we do the same?
Yeah, it does. The German system's interesting. So it introduces at full price, and then they have payer negotiations and eventually settle on a final price. I think the challenge with that, so I shouldn't say things that the industry is going to hate. I would rather do things sustainably. So the potential disadvantage, the thing that you would need to watch out for in that sort of arrangement, is that you reach a conclusion after a period of time that the drug isn't cost effective, or the company isn't willing to bring the price to the level you want it to be. You fail to reach an agreement and you withdraw the drug from the market. That is a really challenging situation, because then you get patients who have access for a while, maybe stop having access after a period of time. So I think whatever you do, my preference is that you do it in a sustainable way. You do it in a way that, you know, once you've got a medicine onto the market, assuming that you don't get a safety signal or something else comes up where you have to withdraw because it doesn't turn out to be as safe as you thought it was. But assuming all else being equal, once you've released a medicine onto the market and people have access to it, they should have it forever. You know,
yes. Yeah.
And so that's one of the sort of disadvantages. I do think we're moving really interesting direction now. I mean, I would really encourage. We've got this brilliant opportunity. The MHRA, the regulator, and NICE, the payer, are working more closely together than they ever have before. They're very committed to joint scientific advice, where you sit, when very early on in your development program, you can sit with the regulator, NICE, and NHS England and show them your data, tell them what you're doing, ask for their feedback. You can iron out problems with your study design, with your evidence package at that stage. So I think engaging very early on in your development program so that you know you're collecting the right data, and then having the MHRA and NICE do a joint assessment or a parallel assessment so that they agree together that it's clinically effective and cost effective, and you get a decision at the end of which you can roll the medicine out there and then. I think for me, that would be my great preference. And then probably more flexibility with outcomes. So in situations where there are unanswered questions, we have a process where you can consistently have access at a price. And once you've answered those questions, once you've got a better understanding of the data, that price can change. It can go up if it turns out it's more cost effective. In a wonderful world, that would be backdated. So not only if your medicine is more cost effective than you thought and you could have charged a higher price, could they pay that back to the point of launch? I mean, I think there are things that we could do to make the system much more innovative, much more willing to reward innovation.
Yeah, but we're not necessarily being risk averse. We rather seek a sustainable approach or solutions.
Well, that's my take on it. I mean, the German system, German prices tend to be higher, I think, than the UK. It's often difficult to know because the UK has what we call confidential discounts. So NICE agrees a confidential discount with the company. So you're never really sure about how big a discount it is. So we don't really know.
Do we care to know as patients? Do we need to know this?
I don't think
Maybe
you
it's
do.
industry
I think
thing.
you need to trust that your medicine works and it's going to be effective and it's going to do what it says. That's all I care about, really. Yes. I think as a government, as a healthcare system, we need to be more transparent about why we say no to medicines. If we do end up with a disagreement, because I mean, I think quite honestly, the NICE process, the way we assess medicines, it's consistent. It does work for most medicines, but there are quirks in the system where sometimes it doesn't work and doesn't reward innovation as well as it could. We have a measure called the QALY. We're willing to pay a certain amount of money per quality adjusted life year. So a medicine that improves the quality of life or improves the duration of life, so saves lives or improves quality of life, will give you a certain number of QALYs, and the healthcare system is willing to pay a certain amount for each of those. So if you introduce a new medicine, if the existing medicine cost £20,000 in total for a year's treatment, and your additional QALY gain meant you could have 25,000, you get that extra cost. Your entire reimbursement can be what the old medicine cost plus your extra money that you get for being more effective, your QALY gain. So there are a couple of quirks in the system. The first of those is if you don't replace something. So if you're a new medicine and it's innovative and you replace a very expensive drug, then you get all of that cost. If you've a new medicine that's very innovative and there's never been a medicine to treat that area, there's no costs to replace. And so that's really problematic. So therapy areas where there were lots of treatment before NICE came into existence, the very first NICE assessment, if you were being assessed against a more high cost medicine, then your very first NICE assessment back in 1999, that first medicine would have been more expensive than in a therapy area where there was nothing, placebo, free, whatever, because you don't get the offset cost.
Yeah,
so
but
that's
the
challenging.
way I understood this is that the new medications or treatments that do not replace others, that's where real innovation is.
It's where the innovation is. Yeah, of course. It's where the unmet need is. And yet it's where you'll get your least reimbursement. Incremental benefit over something already quite expensive is more rewarding than genuine innovation in an area where there's nothing, because of the way the system operates. And incremental innovation, if you introduce a medicine that's marginally better every year for 10 years, eventually the medicine at the end of that will be quite expensive, relatively speaking, because it's been incrementally more expensive than each relatively expensive medicine. If you don't innovate for 15 years, then you might be comparing against the generic medicine.
Yeah.
Interestingly, if you get your NICE assessment the year before something goes off patent versus the year after it goes off patent, you can have quite a big price difference because you're all of a sudden you're going up against a cheaper drug.
Yes.
So there are quirks in the system because of how it works. And then there's also multiple indication pricing. So one of the things that's very controversial in cancer is where you've got a medicine that can be used to treat different diseases. Quite a lot of cancer, having a breast cancer or a lung cancer or a colon cancer isn't really the main issue in terms of deciding how you treat it. Cancer is a genetic disease and it's often driven by changes in the proteins in a cell, caused by mutations, caused by cigarette smoking, for example, causes your DNA, the basic building block of life, to change. You get mutations and that can result in a cancer developing. And a lot of our therapies are used to try and target that change, to switch off the gene, to block the protein or whatever. And you tend to find the same proteins are, because they're responsible for cell growth, they exist in every cell in the body. So very often these medicines that block a certain protein will work in a breast cancer that exhibits that protein or a colon cancer that exhibits that protein. Now, the challenge is, of course, the treatments in those two different cancer types will be different. Existing treatments, the chemotherapy options will be different. Some might be more expensive than the other. The drug might work a little bit better in one cancer type than another. So you could find the same medicine being approved for two totally different cancer types and having a very different cost effectiveness case in each one. And the challenge in the healthcare system at the moment in the UK is that once you've got a price, it doesn't go up for a subsequent more cost effective indication. So you could innovate in a really rare tumour and be much more cost effective in that tumour and therefore command a higher price. The NHS struggles to reward that. You get pegged on one price. So there are lots of sort of quirks within the system that make it difficult to navigate.
Hi, I'm Hala, your host today. If you're enjoying what you see, please hit that lovely subscribe button. It will mean a lot to us. Or maybe a small podcast now, but with your support, we can build this channel together, one step at a time. Thank you so much for being part of it. Here's a silly question. You talked about the first version of medication, the second version, the second, and supposedly there is an improvement within maybe 10 years or something. Why do pharmaceutical companies keep introducing, if they do, introduce new version of the medication? I'm thinking, is this to address side effects maybe?
Yeah, it can be. When you put a drug into a person, when you take a medicine, it does things in the body.
Physiological changes, yeah.
It does things to the body. It does physiological changes. One of those things is what you want it to do, and lots of other things it does aren't what you want it to do, and it causes side effects as a consequence of that. So often you'll find, and by changing the structure of a medicine slightly, you can dial up certain effects more than others. So you can make it more specific for a certain type of protein, and you can target it more towards a specific type of disease. So therefore making it more effective, potentially less toxic, better side effect profile. So very often you'll find a company has a medicine that works for a number of diseases. Some of those diseases it works really, really well for, some it works less well for, but by showing that it worked in those diseases, and that company or another company can look and say, right, okay, what is it about it that's making it work less well in that indication? Can we make a better drug? And that's one of the challenges. Science it's not a perfect art. It's very interesting. We sometimes make discoveries by mistake, totally by mistake. It can be really fascinating, the serendipity of discovery. And once you've made that serendipitous discovery, very often you can improve on what you've originally done. You can make a better drug, a little bit like antibiotics. Antibiotics are fascinating. So the story of antibiotics is that Alexander Fleming, who ran a lab in West London, St Mary's, I think it's fair to say wasn't always scrupulously clean in his lab practices, from what I understand is the case. So he went on holiday in September 1928. He went on a holiday, and when he came back, some of the agar plates, some of the jars of bacteria that he left out, a mold had grown on them, and the bacteria had been killed. And he purified the mold, discovered penicillin, understood how it was working, made a medicine. But once we'd understood how penicillin killed bacteria, it was the first time we'd been able to kill bacteria. And bacteria, if you think about plague and gangrene and all these, a huge portion of human history has been death at the hand of microorganisms. Once we understood how to deal with that, what we could do to kill bacteria without killing humans, it opened the door to create wonderful advanced antibiotics that were even more effective and even safer to use. And I think that's one of the great sort of bits of innovation that we see.
Mentioning antibiotics, do we have a real issue of abusing antibiotics?
One of the great challenges of our time, possibly not quite now, but certainly soon, one of the great fears is antimicrobial resistance. So bugs that no longer respond to antibiotics. I have a great fear that we get to a stage where bacteria are not treatable. That potentially takes us back to a world where we didn't have didn't have antibiotics, didn't have treatments. People used to die of simple infections all the time in large numbers. And when you use antibiotics, every time you use an antibiotic, bugs don't become resistant. This is one of the interesting things. Bugs don't become resistant. They are resistant to an antibiotic. So what happens is you have an infection in your body, and you'll have a ton of bugs in that infection. Most of them will be sensitive to the antibiotic. Most of them will get killed off by the antibiotic. And you maybe have 1, 2, 5% of them which are resistant. But by killing off that big, massive infection, your immune system can then do the rest, and it kills off the small proportion of bugs that are resistant. If you don't take the full course, or if you give antibiotics in a needless situation, you can end up killing, and the various different populations keep each other in check. So if you kill off all the sensitive bacteria that exist within your system, in your body, whatever, the risk is then that what you get is an overgrowth of very resistant bacteria that don't respond to the antibiotics. Yeah. And that's the challenge. That's why you shouldn't use antibiotics if you don't need them. If you've not got a bacterial infection, people get given antibiotics because they've got a virus. It's a terrible thing. And you should, if you're given antibiotics, you should take them as directed. Don't stop after a couple of days because you feel better. We really think this stuff through. So that's that. Yeah, I mean, it's a really big problem. Innovation in this space is really difficult because we don't want to use, if we invented a new antibiotic, we wouldn't want to use it unless we absolutely had to. So
Why is that?
So you wouldn't, because you don't want, if you invent something new, you don't want the bacteria to see it if another medicine would have worked. So it's not like cancer where you want to give it to everyone as soon as you can. If we invent a new antibiotic, eventually resistant strains of bacteria come along for every antibiotic. So the sooner you use an antibiotic and the more you use an antibiotic, the sooner that will happen. So we want to keep any new antibiotics that we create, anything powerful or improved or different, we want to keep it
for a rainy day,
for people who really need it. And so you're not going to make a lot of money from introducing a new antibiotic.
No,
because it's not going to replace, it's not going to be, if you introduce a much better version of a blood pressure tablet, then everyone's going to use that because you're not going to get resistance to it. So you're going to use it. So you're going to replace the whole market. So you're going to get huge reward for your innovation. The normal economics don't work for antibiotics. So companies are a little reluctant to spend huge amounts of money doing research and development in an area where those drugs are going to kind of sit on the shelf and be used for very desperate, very severe cases. So we do need to have a conversation about how we do research and development in that space. There's a really wonderful project, Lord Darcy, who did the NHS review for Wes Streeting just after Labour came into power, is setting up a network of antimicrobial research centres, one on every continent. I think is a really ambitious project. So people are taking it seriously, but yeah, you absolutely don't force your GP to give you antibiotics if you don't need them. Take them the way you're supposed to, and for policymakers, we do need to think about how we innovate in this space and reward that innovation appropriately.
It's striking that usually the blockage or the problem is not science itself, but the process and the economics. Yeah. You also referenced the issue of add-on therapies.
Yeah.
What are these therapies? Why are they not being approved in the UK?
So that's a great. If you Google David Montgomery e-cancer, you'll find a video I did on this many years ago. So if anyone's really interested in this topic, you can look David Montgomery e-cancer, and there's a video, 3 or 4 minute video, which gives a really big explanation with diagrams and things. But it comes down to my previous point. When you introduce a new medicine, the money that you get for that medicine is the money that you save the system. So the old medicine costs £20,000. So you're no longer spending that. So you get that, plus the reward for innovation, the QALY gain, the extra money that they're willing to pay for a more effective medicine. And the NHS is willing to pay £30,000 per QALY, £20,000 to £30,000 per QALY. So a QALY would be 1 year lived in perfect life, one quality adjusted life year. If you live a year in perfect health, then that's one extra, then that's one QALY. Cancer, typically you don't live in perfect health, so you might live it at 50%, 70% health. So let's say you introduce a new medicine that extends life by a year, but the quality of life is half of a normal person's quality of life, or half of perfect health. So the NHS is willing to pay £20,000 per QALY. So you're giving an extra year at half a QALY. So the NHS would be willing to pay £10,000 for that medicine.
Is that how things are judged?
Yeah. So imagine then that you've got a treatment that costs £20,000 for a year and you give it for 1 year. Imagine now that you introduce a new medicine that you take for 2 years. It gives an extra year of life. So you could take it for 2 years. That medicine is worth the 20,000 of the medicine you replaced, plus the 10,000 of your QALY gain. So you get to charge £30,000 for that 2 years of treatment.
Yeah, I get
so
that.
already you've got a lower monthly price, but your total reimbursement, your total revenue is better. Now, imagine that your treatment works by being added into the existing treatment. Imagine it helps a certain type of resistance. So you discover that drug A does what it did, but drug A plus B gives you an extra year.
Okay, so there is already a first drug that's being paid for by the NHS.
Instead of replacing that medicine, you're adding another treatment on, you're giving 2 drugs to have the effect. Okay. Now, so they're willing to pay an extra £10,000 for the combination because it gives you an extra year at half a QALY. So they're willing to give you that extra £10,000 because it's been innovative. Drug A costs £20,000 per year. You're now giving it for 2 years instead of 1.
Okay, I'll have to run the calculations.
So the first company is now making £40,000 from that medicine. But it wasn't the NHS wasn't willing to pay £40,000. It was only willing to pay the £30,000, the £20,000 for 1 year, plus the £10,000 QALY gain. So all of a sudden, so you can see the same effect. So you've got one drug where you replace the medicine, so you get that £20,000 and you get your QALY gain. Another where you're adding it in on top. You've doubled the treatment with the originator medicine. And by doubling the treatment, it costs twice as much. And it costs the second year costs twice as much as your extra QALY gain they were willing to offer you. So they're willing to give you £30,000 in total. It's now costing £40,000 in total. So that's an example where no matter what you do with your price of your new medicine, it's already going to be not cost effective because you've spent all this extra money on the original product.
But how detrimental or beneficial would the add-on therapies be?
So it's giving you an extra year of life.
That's not so bad for families.
But it's a cost effectiveness thing because most of your reimbursement, most of the value that you get is what you replace. If you're not replacing anything, and if you're actually doubling the amount of time on the treatment, you find yourself in a situation when you can never be cost effective.
Okay. Are these therapies are they pertinent to chronic diseases or serious diseases like
they
cancer,
can be.
for example?
Much more common in cancer. This is something we see in cancer a lot, where you've got a treatment and it works very well. You've got another treatment and it works very well, but when you give them together, they work better than the sum of their parts. So there's an additive gain, often because you're targeting. So we've seen, for example, a drug which targets genetic mutations, which targets the sort of proteins, the bad proteins that are causing the cancer to grow, and it works very well. But you can also add in an immunotherapy that helps stimulate the body's immune system to kill the cancer as well. And so these are 2 completely different mechanisms, but they both have an impact on the cancer cells. And together they create a better impact than either of those individual medicines on their own. So we see particularly in cancer, we see this challenge of add-on therapy quite a lot.
Yeah. But it's not necessarily a therapy or a treatment that would save lives. It's usually extends a year, adds a few months to someone's life. Because I would assume if it's going to save someone's life, the NHS would pay for it, right?
Depends how much it costs to save that person's life.
Yeah.
And that's the answer.
Right?
So because the NHS is having to make a decision every day about what it's willing to spend its money on, you could have life-saving treatments that aren't cost effective.
That's so sad, but realistically sad.
That's the truth. I agree. I think that's the vagaries of the system. So how do we overcome that? It is a real challenge. I think healthcare system, NICE does have processes and systems in place, in fairness, for looking at cost effectiveness differently in certain disease areas, particularly ultra rare diseases, orphan conditions. There are processes for trying to deal with the challenge of cost effectiveness, but it is true that some treatments are, by their nature, going to have to be very expensive. They're expensive to manufacture. They're expensive to give gene therapies, cell-based therapies. These are complex, difficult manufacturing processes. The patient populations tend to be small.
Yes.
You're manufacturing for each individual person. So each product, each dose, each drug each intervention is going to be expensive, or it's not going to make a return on investment. And that's the huge challenge, because ultimately drug discovery and drug development is very high risk. It's a commercial enterprise. I worked at a charity. I spent 18 months at Prostate Cancer UK. And when I arrived at Prostate Cancer UK, we were thinking about what we did with our research and how we had a relatively good budget. We had a nice budget, but we didn't have it wasn't billions of pounds, right? It was millions of pounds, 8 to 12 million pounds a year. I think we were spending on new research, new projects, and inventing a medicine. Every medicine costs about 1.5 billion to develop. Not because that's what some of that's what it costs, but much of that is about the number of medicines, the number of molecules that you've tried to get through the system and have failed. So you spend quite a lot of money looking at candidate drugs that never go anywhere. And so the first question I asked myself at Prostate Cancer UK was, do I have, now, if we got lucky, if we invented a medicine, if we spent £5 or £6 million a year on basic science and drug discovery, and we found a medicine in partnership with an academic organisation, and that made it through to patients and became a medicine, we'd be set for life. As a charity, we've invented a medicine that will bring us revenue for the next 10 years, and it can be millions of pounds. And there are charities which have been part of the early discovery programme for a medicine, and they make a lot of money for a period of time as a consequence of having done that. But most charities haven't.
Yes.
And that's the real challenge, because you've got to be able to do this at scale. You've got to be able to do it repeatedly and consistently over a period of time, because you've got to have one success to pay for all the failures.
Yeah.
So if you're spending 4 or 5 million a year on drug discovery and you're never successful over 20 years, you've burned through people will eventually stop giving you money. That's the reality. And so that's the balance. There is a space for academic discovery, and charities are good at funding clever early stage research. And the science, I'm being quite simplistic, because sometimes even if you don't find a medicine, as a charity, you're in a situation where everything that fails tells you something about the disease. So there is a space, I think, for charities. I was a bit more absolute about this when I was younger. There is a space for charities to fund that drug discovery work, even if it doesn't find a medicine, because charities are uniquely able to say, well, we're not for profit. We don't need a return on investment. We just need to be able to say we've done great science and we've moved the field forward. And if as a consequence of that, someone else finds a cure, brilliant. Because as a charity, you're not there to make money or become rich. You're there to fix your disease area. You're there to cure patients. That's your mission in life. So I'm being a bit extreme, but the reality is it's an expensive, difficult, long time consuming process, and companies will do it if they feel there's going to be you've got to go to angel investors, you've got to go to venture capital companies, and you've got to raise money. And these companies want to see a return on investment. And so they accept that there's an attrition rate, they accept that there's a failure rate, but they're going to want to see success. And when there is success, if you're a venture capital company and you back 10 biotechs, if one of them is successful, you want that success to pay for all the other 9 failures, because otherwise you've not made money. Yeah. And so that's the challenge. That's the big difficulty with the economics of drug discovery and drug development.